Hi, my name is Amit, one of the mobile development teachers here at Treehouse. Treehouse, of course, being your best source for online learning, whether it's web, mobile, or any business topics. So check us out at teamtreehouse.com/live. All right, let's jump into today's topic, which is programming with auto layout. Now, auto layout is nothing new. It has been around since iOS 6. They made a lot of improvements in iOS 7. Now, if you don't know what auto layout is, let's take a brief overview. Now, the Apple docs have the definition of auto layout being that it's a way for you to create dynamic UI. So what does that mean? Well, you can create UI that responds to size, like screen size. So if you're creating an app and it should be compatible with a 4-inch screen or a 3.5-inch screen, you want the layout to change based on your orientation, or you want the layout to change based on country or locale, especially if you're creating an app that's going to be serving an international audience. Now, before auto layout, you had you had to create all this like crazy frame math. So each view has a frame property called CG, which is a CG rect, and there you specify the X, Y, the width and height, and you had to do all these crazy frame math to figure out where your sub-view had to be positioned based on your super view. And it was, crazy, and the code was not very maintainable, or you could use auto resizing masks, and they were still lacking. So now with auto layout, you get all this functionality, and you have to do very little work to make your sub-views layout the way you want them to be laid out. So how does auto layout work? Well, the one key factor to making auto layout work is constraints. What are constraints? Well, you can mathematically define a constraint, which is a mathematical definition between two views. And you're probably wondering, what the hell does that mean? So let's look at a super view and a sub view. So let's say you wanted to position a sub view 20 points from the left edge of a super view. Now, you could either hard code that, but that would not really serve your purpose if you want your layout to be, responding to device changes. Or you could mathematically define like, well, I want my sub view to be positioned 20 points from the left edge of my super view. And you can mathematically define that, like superview.x plus 20 is equal to subview.x. I mean, that's like a very vague definition of what a constraint is. But we will look at this in further detail. Now, you can add auto layouts using Interface Builder. You can just drag, drop constraints, and it'll do a lot of the work for you. The problem with doing auto layout in Interface Builder is that you don't get to visually see what the layout is or what your constraints are. I mean, you have a list of them, but I prefer programmatically doing this so that you can actually visually see like, hey, what's my layout going to be? And you have complete control of what your layout's going to be. So how is that possible? Well, there's something called visual format language. And basically, what it is that it's a string object that you provide the NSLayout constraint class, which we will look at when we start, coding an example. But basically here, as you can see, I have a string object, and I have defined two buttons. So in my UI, there'll be button 1 and button 2 with a spacing in between. We'll get to the spacing, but let me look at the semantics of what we've just defined here. So you have the name of view in brackets. So you can see I have button 1, which is in box brackets, and then I have button 2, which is in box brackets. Well, so you have these two things defined, and now where does the button 1 and button 2 come from? Well, these are the names of your variables. So your variable will be called button 1, and your another variable will be called button 2, and they'll be specified in box brackets. The next thing that we have between them is a hyphen. And the hyphen defines standard spacing between the sibling views. Now, as you can see on the right, I have denoted that with an 8, which is 8 points. That is standard spacing between sibling views. Let's take a look at what it looks like if you wanted to not have standard spacing. So, if I didn't want 8 points between the two views and I wanted 20 points, well, that's how you can define it. You can put 2 hyphens and then put in whatever number you want. I've put in 20 in this example, but you can put in whatever number you want, and that's the spacing you'll get between the two views. So next, let's look at an example where you have a super view. So you have a button, and you want 20 points of margin on either side of the button. Now, if I wouldn't have specified 20 here and just left a hyphen, like as you saw in the previous example, by default, the distance between a super view and a sub view is 20 points. So I don't need to specifically say 20 there, but I just put that in there so you can see how you can specify custom numbers over there. Now you'll also notice that there are pipes. Now the pipes represent the super view. So you're basically saying I want 20 points of margin on the left from the super view, and I want 20 points of margin from the on the right from the super view. The other thing that you can do is you can specify an H colon prefix. This is exactly as saying this. However, you can explicitly say, well, this is a horizontal constraint. So if you can specify a horizontal constraint, you can also specify a vertical constraint, and that's what a vertical constraint looks like. Basically, you have a prefix of V colon, and then I say 20, which means I'm specifying that I want 20 points of margin from the top edge of my super view. Now that number can be anything. I just put 20 points there. And once again, if I remove the 20 and just had a single hyphen there, by default, it would be 20. So that's an introduction to the visual format language. Let's go over to the Apple documentation to look at some more of what the visual format language has to offer. Now that link is provided in the description or the notes section, so if you just want to click on that, you'll be able to see exactly what I'm looking at over here. So we already discussed the standard spacing. Oops. The next thing is a width constraint. So if you actually wanted to say my button should be greater than or equal to 50, you can specify that by putting parentheses right here. Whoops. That should not happen. You can specify that by parentheses within the box brackets. So here we're basically saying my button should not be less than 50 points. We already looked at the super view, so here's another example of how you can define something in relation to its super view. Here is a vertical layout. So basically this vertical layout, you're saying, well, I want 10 points between the top field and the bottom field. So that's how you would define a vertical layout between multiple views. Now, if I don't specify a hyphen, basically the two views will be flushed against each other. We haven't discussed priorities, but constraints do have priorities. So you can have multiple constraints defined on a single view, and then you can define a priority as in which constraint takes priority over the other. Finally, you have equal. So here I can say button 1 is equal to the width of button 2. And you can also, put a number there. So if you wanted to hard code a number, you could do that too. And finally, you have multiple predicates. So you can say it can be greater than or equal to 70, but no less than or equal to 100. And here's a complete line where you're defining a complex layout. So that's exactly what we'll do right now. We'll jump into an example project that I've created so we can create a complex layout and get further understanding of how visual format language works. By the way, if you want to follow along in the notes or description, there's a link to the GitHub repo, and you can download the project and you can follow along. It's basically exactly where I am starting. This is not the finished project that you have access to right now. We'll put that up. We'll put up the finished project up on GitHub later. But basically, this is what it is. Here you have the profile image. So there's a nice little kitten over there. And then you have first name, last name, and you have a comment box. Now I've colored these just so that we can see how the auto layout works when resizing it. I'm going to run this application so we can see what it looks like. Now, I mean, it's pretty much what it looks like in the storyboard. Anyway, let's run it. And the simulator's coming up. There it is. Just takes a while. And our app crashed. Okay. That's not a good start, I guess. It's saying this class is not key value coding compliant. Okay. So let me fix this real quick. So there's our UI view controller. And I have a few properties defined in the UI view controller. And I also have these properties that are connected to the main storyboard. So if I open up the assistant editor, there is my main storyboard. And let's look at the view controller. And there is my class, which is, let's see, we have th view controller. Okay, so here we have our basic class, and we have our properties, which are outlets. Let me hide the utility pane so you can see that. So this is our first outlet, which is our first name. This is our second outlet, which is our last name. This is our third outlet, which is the text view, and so on and so forth. Okay, and let's go over to our implementation file. I'm going to open up the standard editor. So usually what I do, well, before I continue, let me just make sure I don't have any connections defined that shouldn't be there. So here we have, I have some old connections here, and maybe that's why it crashed. So there is, so our comment view, our first name, our image view, last name, and text view. So if I run this application, hopefully it'll run now and it won't complain. And I still get an error. I'm going to just remove all these connections that I have defined. Maybe I had some remnant connections in there, and that's what's causing the error. So let's just remove all these connections here. Okay, and now if I run it, all right, fine. At least we have a working app, and no big deal. Now we just have to wire up the properties with our, our views once again. So let's, sorry, I'm like all over the place here. Let me open up the assistant editor so we can see this side by side. So basically that's our view. So let me just go ahead and wire this up. So there is our first name. There is our last name, which is a UI label. And there is our text view. And finally, here is our image view. Okay, let's run our application. No errors. Great. All right, so now we can start with visual format language. So heading over to our thviewcontroller.m, which is basically our only view controller. I'm going to get rid of that assistant editor. So let me just put in some spaces here. So the first thing that we need in our viewDidLoad method, I don't like to put in all this constraint code directly in the viewDidLoad method. I like to create a separate method. So let's create a method, and we can call this add constraints. Right? And then we can call this method from our viewDidLoad method. So we'll say self add constraints. All right, there we go. So right now, of course, we don't have anything in this method, so it won't do anything. So what do we need? Well, first we need local variables for all our properties. Why we need the local variables, I'll explain that in a minute, but let's go ahead and create the two labels, which is first name equals self.firstname, UI label last name equals self.lastname, and then you have UI image view, is equal to self.image view. And we're still missing the text view, so let's do that. UI text view. And I'm going to call this comment equal to, I think I just called this text view, yeah. And probably that was the error that was happening. Okay, so now that we have all our views, we need to create a dictionary of all our views. So we need a NS dictionary called views, and this will be using a macro. So the macro, what does the macro do? Well, let's click on it to see what exactly it does. So I just command clicked on the macro, and as you can see, here is the definition of it. It basically creates a comma-separated key value pairing. So it takes the views and it creates the view name as the key, and the value will be actually just the object, the actual view. So that's what this helpful little macro does for us. Otherwise, you'll have to do this manually. So the other way you could do this is just simply saying NS dictionary views, and then you can use a literal, and you can define it yourself. You can say first name, blah, blah, blah. So you get the idea. But instead of that, we'll use this helpful little macro to create our dictionary. So it was NS dictionary of variable bindings. So all you have to do is pass it a list of all the views that you need to create a dictionary of. So there's our first name, last name, image view, and comment. All right, so we have our dictionary. Next we need is, we need to create our constraints. So we'll create an array of constraints, and we'll use the class called NS layout constraint. Now I'm going to option click on this class so we can look at the documentation. Going to hide this over here. So here's the documentation for NS layout constraint. And it has basically two methods or two convenience constructors. The first one is constraints with visual format, and that's the one that we'll be using. And the other one is constraint with item. So here you can define how you want, you can define like a custom multiplier based on width or height. We're not going to be using that. We'll be using constraint with visual format because we want to see what the visual format language is like and how we can work with the ASCII art. So here's the method. So going back to our code, we'll say constraint, constraint with visual format. And let me just format this a little better so we can read it. Let me also hide the navigation pane. All right, so constraint with visual format takes 4 arguments. The first one is the string, which is our ASCII art or the visual format. The next one are options and metrics. We'll get back to these two. I'll explain them in detail later. And then our views. We already have the views, so let me paste that over here. That's great. We've created a dictionary of our views. The next thing for options, for now we'll just say 0. And for metrics, I'll just say no. We'll come back to it. So for the string, now we discussed about superviews being pipes. So let's go back here. Let me open up our main storyboard in a separate tab or in a separate window. That's fine too, I guess. Here, let me close this. Command T, and then I can open up our storyboard. There we go. So that's where you can switch between the two tabs. You don't have to, switch between different windows. So here is our main.storyboard. So we have our first name, last name, image view, and text view. So if I wanted to define the relationship between the image view and the first name, the horizontal constraints, basically, as you can see, there is margin here on the left, and that could be just standard margin, which is 20 points. And if I just put in a dash here, I will get 8 points between this image and the first name. And then we want similar margin on the right, which is 20 points. So how would we define that? We're using our visual format language. Well, so the pipes are here referring to the super view. Just gonna drink some water here. So pipes are referring to the super view, and let's put a dash here. Now, if I want to refer to my image view, it's basically the name of my local variable, which is image view. Let me hide the navigation controller so you can see this better. And then another dash here. And once again, if I'm referring to my first name, I'll just put that here in box brackets. And then a dash here, basically saying I want standard margin from on the right of my super view. So let's run this constraint. But we can't run it yet because we have to add this constraint somewhere. And where do we add it? Well, we add it to our main view property of our view controller. So we'll say self.view add constraints. We'll say constraints. The reason I created an array and not a single constraint object is because we're going to keep adding to this constraint. We'll add multiple constraints and we'll create an array of constraints, and then we'll add those constraints to our main view property. So let's run this application and see what happens. And we get an error. And I completely expected this, so I'm okay with this error. And let me hide this so you can see this error completely. So one thing you'll notice here in this error, it says IB auto-generated at build time. So IB, of course, stands for Interface Builder. And Interface Builder is kind enough, I say kind enough, to create constraints automatically for us, even though we don't want them, but it does generate them automatically. So let me stop our application, and I'll hide the debug window. Let's go over to our main.storyboard so I can point something out to you. Opening up the utility area, and let's go over to the size inspector. And in the size inspector, in the utility area on the right, here I've highlighted, you can see it says the selected views have no constraints. At build time, explicit left, top, width, and height constraints will be generated for the view. And that is so kind of Interface Builder to do that for us. Although we don't want these constraints. We want complete control over the constraints that we are creating over here. So what we have to do is, at the top of our add constraints method, we have to remove these constraints that are going to be generated for us by Interface Builder. So I'll refer to our view property, and I'll say remove constraints. And where do I get these constraints from? Well, our view also has a property called constraints. And these are the ones that are automatically generated. So I'll just remove them, and then we will create our own constraints and add them back into the view. So if I run my application now, as you can see, we didn't get any errors. Now that doesn't look exactly right. That's not what we want. But it's looking better. So one thing that we want to specify here is we want to give our image view a fixed width. As you can see, the image view was being stretched because neither are we specifying a fixed width for our image view, nor are we specifying a fixed width for our first name. So in order for us to specify a fixed view, all we have to do is put it in parentheses over here. So we'll say our image view is 100 points, and the first name will be it wrapped to the next line over here. So that's where the first name is. Let me push this higher. So I want the first name to be, let's say, greater than or equal to 160 points. Now, why greater than or equal to? Because let me go back to the simulator here, or let me run this. So there, this is already looking better. If I do command left arrow, which will, change my simulator into portrait mode, what I want is I want my first name to stretch out. So that's why I'm saying I want it to be minimum 160 points, but it can be greater than that. If I change the layout, I want it to be able to respond to that change in device orientation. Oops. There we go. The other thing that I'll do is I'll add background color to both my labels so we can see how our labels are responding to this change in the change in device orientation. So just adding whatever color is available here. So if I run my application again, you'll see that the first name is stretching basically, and it's responding to device orientation, and that's exactly what we want. We haven't done anything for last name, so we'll come to that now. All right, so now that we have one of our constraints, how can we keep adding to this array of constraints? Well, we can say constraints equals constraints array by adding objects from array. So we already have an object in this array. We can keep adding to it and create a new array. So how will we create this new array? Well, we can copy our previous NS layout constraint, and we can paste that here. I'm just going to add a new line so that we can maintain some of that nice formatting that we created. All right, so as you'll notice, one thing I didn't specify here is that H colon. So by default, it always defaults to a horizontal constraint. So if you don't specify it or if you forget, don't worry, it'll always default to horizontal. I usually like to, prefix it. So when I'm looking at it at a glance, I know exactly whether it's a horizontal or a vertical constraint. So we've already specified how we want our image view to be. We basically want our image view 20 points from the left. We want it to be a fixed width of 100, so we don't need to mention that all over again. We can actually remove that from here. It doesn't hurt that if you want to keep that, but note that if you do change anything, then you'll get conflicts. Basically, it'll say like, well, you already specified one thing here, and then you're specifying another thing here. It will throw an error. So this is not first name, this will be last name. So here we're basically saying we want our last name to be spaced evenly from image view, and we want it to be at least 160 points. So now running our application, and as you can see, we get our first name and last name. They're appropriately sized and they're appropriately spaced from the image view. And if I, go to landscape layout, they both stretch in width. So we're doing really good. Now, one thing you'll notice is that we've repeated the width over here, and we'll probably repeat that width with our text view too. And the other thing is maybe you don't want to specify standard spacing. Maybe you want custom spacing, and I want to specify, 20 there or 15. So if you're repeating certain numbers over and over again, you don't want to hard code the values. You want those values to be stored in a variables somewhere so that you can reuse them. And that's what metrics is about. So let's go back and create a dictionary called metrics. And we'll say at curly brace. So the first metric we'll say here is a string. So we'll do key values. And we'll say this is a horizontal, we'll say this is a width. Let's just keep it easy. So what is our width? Well, our width is 160, right? Since this is a number, that's why I'm putting an @ sign before it. So that's a number object, 160. The next thing I want to say is I want horizontal spacing. And what do I want here? Let's say we want 15. Next, I want to define vertical spacing. And this would be, let's say, 10. And these can be anything you want, and the keys can be anything you want to call them. I mean, I'm just naming them because I just like to be clear as to what spacing is, whether it's horizontal, whether it's vertical, and so on and so forth. I would even be more verbose with the width, but let's keep it at width for now. So what we can do is this dictionary that we created, we can pass that as a parameter to metrics over here. And now these keys can be used inside your visual format language. So instead of 160, I can specify width. And over here, since I want a custom horizontal spacing, let me put this in new line so you can see it. It's not exactly how I want to code, but just so that you can see it in one line, it's kind of nice that way. So, all right, I just want you to see that in one line. So I'm going to put this back here, and there we go. That's a little better. Not exactly pretty code, but at least you can see it all in one line. So we have our image view with the horizontal spacing, and then we have our first name with a minimum width that's specified in our dictionary. So we can do this exact same thing over here in our next constraint for the last name. And let me put this also on a new line. And I'll copy the horizontal spacing because we want to be consistent here. And I'll copy the width, so replacing the 160 with a width. Now, if I run my application, nothing would have changed. Oops, I forgot a colon here somewhere. So do not forget to specify your colons. They are not commas. So there's our key and our value. All right, so running our application. So as you can see, nothing's really changed except for this horizontal spacing here. We have a little more margin between the two, a little more breathing room. It looks a little better. We'll fix the breathing room on top over here because the status bar it seems like it's almost flush to the top over there. So, all right, our app's already looking a little better, responds to our device orientation. So let's continue adding a few more constraints. So I'm going to copy the second constraint, not the first one because that's the first one that we built, but here we're actually adding to the objects of our array. That's why the second constraint. And let's add some constraints for our comment. So we already have our image view. We have our horizontal spacing. So all we have to do is replace the last name, with comment here. Okay, so that's all we need to do. We have everything else kind of set up. So as you can see, if you're scrolling down, you can easily see like, hey, what does my format look like, or what does my layout look like? And you can easily tweak things so that it can, you can tweak your layout because you can visually see it here. That's why I love this ASCII art way of using auto layout so much more than just interface builder. So Command R to run our application. and we still can't see our text view. That's because we haven't specified any horizontal or vertical layout yet. So let's go ahead and add a vertical layout so that our, so that our comment box shows, because right now it doesn't know how it should be placed vertically. So once again, I'm going to copy this last constraint that we created. Just want to make sure it's called comment. Yes, it is. All right, so here now, instead of prefixing it with an H, I'll prefix it with a V because it is a vertical constraint. So how do we want it to be spaced from our super view? I'm not going to put the image view right now because we're going to lay out how the three views on the right stack against each other. How is the first name positioned according to the super view, and how are the other of its siblings positioned relative to the first name? So we can say standard spacing, although I don't want standard spacing. So I'll say first name. And here I'll say vertical spacing. And let's remove this comment. So let's put last name. So I have first name with standard spacing to the top edge of the main view. Then I have vertical spacing, and then after that I have the last name. And then I have the comment. Let's not forget our vertical spacing here too. All right, so pretty standard. We have last name and comment with vertically spaced, which what we've defined in our dictionary over here. And then the first name is using standard spacing in relation to its super view, which is our main view. So let's run this. And as you can see, our comment is just enormously long. We'll come back to that. But yeah, you see the standard spacing over there. I'm still not happy about the fact that our first name is flushed to the top of our screen. So, because it almost looks like it's running into the status bar. So let me stop this, and let's say it should be 50 at least, right? And let's run our application. So that looks a little better. We have a little more breathing room there. Of course, if I showed it to a designer, they might critique that, but hey, that's what designers are for. So one thing you realize that we pushed down the first name, but we did not push down the image view. So how do we do that? Well, that's where the options come into play. So let's go back to our very first constraint where we defined the relationship between the image view and the first view. And here's our options parameter. So if I option click here, it's going to give me a few more details about what the option parameter is about. And here it is. It says NS layout format options. So let's click on it. And here we go. Here are all the options. So basically what NS layout format options is telling us is that how do you want your sibling views aligned? We've defined the relationship horizontally, but do you want their y coordinates to also match to each other? Do you want their y coordinates at the bottom? Do you want their bottoms to align? Do you want their tops to align? Or if you're aligning them vertically, then do you want their left or their x coordinates to align? So that's exactly what these format options are for, and they're great because they're a bitwise operation, so you can combine a couple of them if you wanted to. So I'm going to copy here. It's called NS layout format align all top. So let's copy that. So basically what I'm saying is I want the top edge of my image view and the first name to be aligned with each other. So what this will automatically do is it's going to push down the image view to match where the first name starts, because we put in a hard-coded metric or a hard-coded constraint saying that first name should start from 50 points below the super view. So it honors that constraint. And then it says like, well, if we're pushing down the first name and if you want both of them to be aligned, then I'm going to push down the image view too. Now, the next thing we can do is we can say that we want the bottom of our comment and the image view aligned. So here we've defined a horizontal constraint between the image view and the comment. So if I say, going back here, NS format align all bottom, as you can see, just as we can align the top edges, we can align the bottom edges. So if I say align bottom, it should then be sized, well, it's stretching that. And I understand why it's stretching it, because I said comment should be flush to the super view. And this is where copy pasting goes awry. Just make sure that any constraints that you put in that don't need to be there shouldn't be there. So if I remove that and I run the application once again, there you go. Now it looks nice and neat where the bottom edge of our text view is aligned to the image view and everything has nice margin and padding all across. And the best thing is if I do Command L in the simulator, you can see that the text view stretches, so we can see more of the text, but everything else kind of stays in position and we have that nice margin and padding. So it all looks great. And if we remove all this color from our labels, so if I just go back to background defaults, you'll see that it really looks nice. It doesn't have a lot of design to it. If I run the application once again, there you go. You have the nice looking layout, and it all works pretty well. So that's visual format language. We've covered a lot of ground here, and basically, created a pretty decent sized layout, defined relationships between super views. We defined relationship between sibling views. We looked at horizontal spacing, vertical spacing, how you can define minimum widths or fixed widths. Looked at metrics, options, creating an array of constraints. There's a lot more to this. So we didn't even cover priorities, but you can look at them if you're creating really complex views. So do check out the visual format language, the documentation, and basically all of the documentation. There's a link here that says working with auto layout programmatically. So if you just click on that link on the left column in the table of contents, it'll give you a little more information if I didn't cover this. But it's just great stuff. I really love working with this programmatically because, as you can see, it's so easy to read and it's so easy to debug too, because you can find the mistake sometimes, but if you can't, it gives you that verbose error message in the debugging area. So we'll see you next time. Have a good one.